Okay, we're rounding the bend on phase one of the Crash Course in Jewish History, which is the development of Jewish civilization. It's 4,300 years. Let's just do a little review before you finish it up, this phase, and get to the Mishna and Talmud. So here goes. The numbers are 1,000, 1,500, 1,000. 1,000 years from Adam to Noah, 1,000 years from Noah to Abraham. 500 years later, we get the Torah at Mount Sinai, and then 1,000 years later, we've canonized the books of the prophets and the writings. And then we had the last two numbers, 500, 300. It was 500 years from the prophets and the writings to the giving of the Mishnah, which we're going to talk about today, and 300 years later from the Mishnah to the Talmud. Now, in the last video, we covered the Second Temple era, which was the major part of this 500 years. We didn't get to the Mishnah, but being that we're going to go from the Mishnah to the Talmud in this section, we'll focus on this, and we're going to discuss how we got to the Mishnah and the difference between the Mishnah and the Talmud. Now, in order to understand this section, we have to get clear on something which many people aren't aware of, and that is that there were actually two Torahs given to the Jewish people by God to Moses. The first is the written Torah. That's the 5 books of Moses. That's from Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy. We cover that in the Crash Course in Torah. And then there was the oral Torah. Now, what's the difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah? Well, the written Torah recounts the background behind the covenant that the Jewish people entered with God, right? It starts with creation, everything leading up to what happens at Mount Sinai, and then the first number of years of the Jewish people being in the covenant with God. The oral Torah, which was given by God to Moses, then provides a much more comprehensive understanding of the covenant. So it'll explain the meaning of all the different verses throughout the Torah and give us deeper insight. So, for example, when Abraham goes to bind his son Isaac as a sacrifice to God, in the written Torah, that episode is quite terse. There are very few verses giving over what happened. It's in the oral tradition you'll understand the deeper meaning and get a much more detailed presentation of what was going on through that whole event, that whole test. The second difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah is the written Torah lists the 613 biblical commandments. It only lists them, meaning throughout the 5 books, you're going to find in various parshas of the Torah different commandments, but it's in the oral Torah that you get the explanation on how to fulfill the 613 commandments. So, for example, in the written Torah, it tells us, observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Well, what does that mean to observe the Sabbath day? What does it mean don't do any work? All that's explained in the oral tradition. What does it mean to keep it holy? Give charity. Well, how much do you give? When do you give it? Who gets first? All that is explained in the oral tradition. Don't kill. Is that always? What about war? Are there ever situations when you're permitted to kill? And so on. What about a court of law? So the written Torah is the listing, essentially, of the biblical commandments. It's in the oral tradition that God explained to Moses how we're supposed to fulfill them. Now, in terms of quantity, the written Torah is about 1% of the entire Torah. It's the oral tradition, which is 99% of our tradition. And that's why it's so important to understand the nature of the oral tradition, which we're going to cover in the Crash Course in Jewish Tradition coming up. One other distinction, which I think is quite obvious, but it's important just to identify, is that the written Torah is read. That's how the Jewish people learned it. The oral tradition was passed down orally for 1,500 years, from parent to child, from rabbi to student. And that's the dynamic of learning. The Torah was read, and then you had this massive tradition which people had to master because they wouldn't write it down. It had to be given over orally. And that's the way it worked for 1,500 years. So now let's get back to the Crash Course in Jewish History. So why do we have the Mishnah? So let's understand. The Roman period goes all the way into the year 476 of the Common Era. We saw in the previous video that the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70 in the Common Era. So the temple and Jerusalem lay in ruins. Most of the Jewish people have now been exiled from the land a second time. You have a community in Babylon, and you still have a small minority of Jews living in Israel. But it's a time of terrible Roman persecution. And therefore, it's very difficult for the Jewish people to maintain this oral tradition orally. And therefore, for the first time, the rabbis realized it was now necessary to write down the oral law. And in the year 200 of the Common Era, the Mishnah was compiled. The Mishnah is the code of the oral tradition. What the rabbis did was they wrote short, terse, dense paragraphs of case law, and then a rabbi would study it with their student and analyze the paragraph and bring out the entirety of the oral tradition. They would use that short paragraph of law as a basis then to give over the rest of the tradition orally. It was like a cue card in a way. The rabbi who led the compiling of the Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was in Israel, and he called together 3,000 of the leading sages. Many came from Babylon to participate in now taking the oral tradition and putting it down into written form. But again, I want to point out that they want to maintain the oral integrity of the law, which meant they didn't want to make it explicit. You needed a rabbi, teacher, or parent to explain to the student or their child what was intended within that paragraph of law. Unfortunately, as the exile persisted and the conditions worsened, it was getting difficult even for the Jews to understand what was intended in every single Mishnah, meaning there was so much oral law packed in that mining all the understanding was still a gargantuan task. And therefore the rabbis realized they had to decode the Mishnah. The decoding of the Mishnah is the Talmud, which was completed in the year 475 of the Common Era. And what I mean by the decoding is that the Talmud is a written discussion of rabbis analyzing every single Mishnah. So by following their discussion and seeing everything they brought out from a Mishnah, we could then maintain our understanding of our oral tradition. Let me give you an example of the difference between Mishnah and the Talmud. Here's a classic case in Jewish law. Two men find a tallis, a prayer shawl, and they both claim that it's theirs. What do you do? So the Mishnah states the following. Two people are holding on to a tallis, that's a prayer shawl. This one says, I found it, and this one says, I found it. This one says, it's all mine, and this one says, it's all mine. Then this one swears that not less than 1/2 of it is his, and this one swears that not less than 1/2 of it is his, and then they split it. So that's a case found in a volume of Jewish law called Baba Metzia, chapter 1, Mishnah number 1. And the Mishnah seems pretty straightforward. But when you open up the Talmud, you realize there's a lot we need to understand. And here's some of the questions the Talmud would ask. First of all, what constitutes finding? Is seeing the object finding it, or do you have to pick it up to take possession of it to find it? Secondly, why the repetition? Why say it's all mine after you said I found it? Obviously, when you say I found something, you mean it's all mine. Thirdly, how are they holding on to it? Are they holding on to the ends? Would it make a difference if this guy's holding on to it over here and this guy's holding on to the end? Fourthly, why swear not less than half of it is theirs? If they both think that the whole thing is theirs, why not swear that the whole thing is theirs? Why are they swearing that not less than half of it is theirs? That's a pretty strange way of making the oath. And finally, how do they split it? Do they split it monetarily? Do they split it with a scissors? Those are just some of the questions the Talmud would have on this Mishnah. And believe me, there are pages and pages and pages of Talmud just for this one single Mishnah. So I hope that helps give you a sense of the difference between the two. And we'll talk more about this in the crash course in Jewish tradition. So it's time to do a little review. So here we are in the final 300 years from the Mishnah of the Talmud. Remember, 2 Torahs were given at Sinai, a written Torah and an oral Torah. The written Torah recounts the background behind the covenant the Jewish people entered with God. The oral Torah provides much more of an understanding of the covenant in detail. The written Torah lists the 613 biblical commandments. The oral Torah explains how we're supposed to fulfill them in much greater detail. Basically, the written Torah is 1%, where the oral Torah is 99%. We read the written Torah while the oral Torah was passed down orally for 1,500 years. So why do we have a Mishnah? Well, the Roman period was full of persecution. In the year 70 of the Common Era, the Second Temple was destroyed. It was getting hard to pass on the oral tradition one generation to the next. So the Mishnah was compiled in the year 200 of the Common Era, and that's the coding of Jewish law. But as the conditions for exile grew worse, the rabbis realized they needed to decode the Mishnah for the people, and therefore the Talmud was completed in the year 475 of the Common Era, and that's the decoding of the Mishnah.